Is that loud enough? Yeah. Cool. Thank you all for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started because it's 7 and everybody's here. I appreciate that so many of you have been moved by the issue of housing to come out here tonight. It's really important that we have these discussions with each other on the ground level so that we can make the city, the state, and eventually the country a better place. The issue of unaffordable housing is of super high prevalence here in Madison, as you know, I'm sure all of you have noticed. Personally, I grew up in this city, and I've watched it grow and change in a really dramatic way over the years. There's a 2022 report by York IE that says that Madison is the third fastest growing startup city in the country. Startup growth was reported in that report to be up by 793%, and that was back in 2022. We've got places like Epic and Exact Sciences that have kind of transformed our whole economic ecosystem here. According to another report by the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, Exact Sciences relocation to Madison has driven a total economic impact of 20,650 jobs and 6 to 7 billion in added GDP for Wisconsin, which is roughly 1.7 to 2% of the entire state economy. With that has come a transformation of Madison's neighborhoods as expensive businesses move in to profit off of the city's richer citizens. Some of the change in the city has taken place during my lifetime here has been positive. We have a better bus system. I think we have better community spaces, more of them. And I'm certainly not against economic success in a city. But a lot of the economic prosperity we've experienced in this city over the past few years has been reserved for only the city's more fortunate citizens. It doesn't take long to notice the economic disparity which exists in Madison. You really only need to walk down the street. Walking down State Street, as an example, you'll see high-rise apartments whose shadows loom over people struggling with homelessness and drug addiction. Under these apartments, you'll also see expensive stores and restaurants all over. Many of the people who work in those businesses, though, likely struggle to pay their rent and other expenses because the cost of living is skyrocketing here in Madison. The cost of living here is 4% higher than the national average, and housing costs are 9% higher. The median rent of the city is a whopping $1,739. Many people work second or third jobs just to be able to afford housing or otherwise are forced out of the city. On top of rent, people of course face medical bills, utility bills, vehicle expenses, and often have to support their children and other family members. Too many people in this city are just a missed paycheck away from homelessness. This is an example of why so many issues facing this city find their root in the housing crisis. When people lack important safety nets, they can easily be forced into homelessness. As of January 2025, Madison had nearly 800 homeless people, which is a 7% increase from 2024 and a 20% increase since 2020. And with sparse support for the homeless, these people can fall prey to the addiction crisis also facing this city. But it's not just Madison. The United States as a whole is facing a housing crisis. Madison is just a mirror of metro areas across the city, or across the country, rather. Some of which have it even worse. Homelessness, luxury apartments, drug addiction, trendy coffee shops, poor zoning, mixed-use buildings that contain only expensive shops and luxury apartments, and poor public transportation set the scene across our country. I should note, mixed-use development is generally a positive thing that affordable housing fans push for, but we often see kind of an abomination of mixed-use buildings that just have fancy businesses and then luxury apartments. I want to make that clear. But that's why the focus tonight is going to largely be on Madison and Wisconsin. We're also here to talk about the issue as a whole and how what we do here can impact the whole country. So why is there such an epic housing crisis in Madison and in Wisconsin and in the United States? Across the country in general, the issue is not that there aren't enough homes. In fact, as per the Census Bureau, there were approximately 15.1 million vacant homes nationwide in 2024. According to a study by United Way NCA, there are currently 28 vacant homes for every one person experiencing homelessness in the U.S. city of Detroit. And the U.S. city of Detroit has the most vacant homes per unhoused person at 116 empty homes per unhoused person. Syracuse, New York has the second most at 110 vacant homes per unhoused person. In Madison, it is a little different, admittedly. Vacancy rates here are incredibly low, and a part of our housing crisis stems from a lack of supply and from very high demand. But on a fundamental level, both of these things come from the same place. The issue of affordability in Madison and in the rest of the country stems from the fact that here in the US, housing is not considered a human right, but instead is a commodity. It's the same as coffee, magazines, crude oil, toys, or cell phones. Housing people is not the primary goal of landlords or of developers. Their goal, rather, is selling a product and making a profit. I want to use the example of Vienna for kind of an opposite approach to housing. There, the government plays a much larger role in housing its citizens because they see doing so in a fundamentally different way. Housing to them is a human right, the same as clean air, education, or healthcare. They are highly involved in building housing and not just drab, low-quality, crumbling blocks like we might imagine when we think of affordable housing here in the US, but they build comfortable, attractive, and high-quality living spaces. The rent averages about $700 for a single-bedroom apartment. About half of Vienna's 2 million residents live in social housing, and 80% of the population qualify for it because their social housing is not seen as like a last resort option for its poor citizens, but as a right of all people. The private market still exists in Vienna, but it doesn't control housing as a whole the way it does in the United States. Housing must be decommodified here. It must be treated as the human right that it is. That's how we begin to heal the crisis. And don't get me wrong, that's just the start. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of initiatives and legislation that need to be brought to the table. We need to do something about public transportation, about zoning laws, about discretionary development, and a million other things, but that's why we're here today. We're all here to talk about our unique ideas and perspectives. And by we, I don't just mean me and the panelists, but you all here in the audience. We have a remarkable array of panelists with varied backgrounds and experiences here, and I'm excited to hear everything they have to say. But what makes me even more excited is to hear you and the panelists interact. These conversations are where it all begins, so they'll all have plenty of questions for them as well. I'm going to have the candidates introduce themselves, and then we're going to turn to you guys and have you come up with your questions for them. So without further ado, and by the way, I want to say, I said your questions, but it can be beyond questions. It can be, food for thought, discussion topics, right? It doesn't just have to be, please answer this question that I have, all-knowing panelists, although they're all very knowledgeable, but it can also be, hey, I want to talk about this, let's talk about this. But anyway, now without further ado, I'd like to give you, the panelists, the opportunity to introduce yourselves. If you could go down this way and then just say what you do, your name, and why you care about affordable housing.
From birth, all right. Hi, I'm Bobby. Okay. Hi, I'm Bobby. I'm a sophomore at Madison. I'm city council over there. And yeah, I care about affordable housing first from a political point of view. So I believe that housing is a human right which provide all people. As a person, I've had my current apartment. I've had the ceiling leak, the fridge broke, mold in the AC. Last week, every single floor hallway was covered in water because of the snow melt deep down. So I know what the landlords do. They have the power to do things to say, sorry, your floor's just late for about a week or two. So yeah, from a personal standpoint and from a political standpoint, that this is one of the most pressing issues, one of the most damning moral stains in our society.
Hi, I'm Juliana, Bennett, and housing is the thing that I care a lot about. Just similar to Bobby, from a personal perspective, I know what it's like to be homeless, to get evicted, to move across town. and still work 3 jobs and not be able to afford rent. And a specific experience I had is that 3 years ago, when my dad experienced cardiac arrest. He survived, thankfully, but as a result, got evicted. And I think that it is an evil thing in our society that someone that literally was like almost on the brink of death to come back and not have a home because of that. So I know that at the time I was on the Madison City Council, that's like making sure that people don't get evicted in those situations is something that we can take action on at the state level, and I'm excited to be on this panel with you all.
Ryan Clancy, I'm a state representative, not for here, but the 19th district, which is Milwaukee's east side, a little east of River West and Bayview. Prior to that, I was on the Milwaukee County Board of Supervisors, where I pushed for something called the right to counsel, so giving folks who are experiencing eviction or threatened with eviction an attorney paid for by the county. It has been wildly successful, and also for some reason, and wildly popular, for some reason unpopular with establishment Dems, who've tried to now defund it, both at the city level and the county level, in both of the 2 last budgets. So I'm now pushing for that to be a statewide right. We can talk more about kind of what those policies look like, but I'm here and I'm pushing for housing, because housing is everything. When you talk to folks in the community, it is always in the top 2, regardless of where you are in the state. It impacts our quality of life, it impacts our physical health, it impacts our success at school and in employment. We have spent many years now, especially in the state, just throwing money at billionaire developers and hoping that they will magically make a lot of affordable, sustainably affordable housing. And to nobody's surprise, they're not. So we have a lot of work to do.
Hi, everybody. The question is, why do I believe in affordable housing? I'm Ozzy. I work with Dane County Homeless Justice Initiative and Madison Tenant Power, which are 2 sort of like tenant advocacy organizations here in town. And like I think that my orientation towards affordable housing is that we know that there is like not enough housing. Or yes, that's what I oh my gosh. Okay, we know right now. It's too loud. It's too Test. Test. Okay. So we know that, you know, there's obviously like a vacancy, like a housing crisis in Madison, that there's a vacancy crisis, and there's certain things that are like special and unique about the Madison market, but we also know that everywhere in Wisconsin, rents are rising. And the reason why rents are rising is because when landlords feel like there's a gap, that they have a justification for raising the rents, they're going to raise the rents, no matter what. No matter if they're putting more money into the housing, no matter if their taxes are going up, no matter if you can't afford it, they're going to increase the rents. And that's the main reason why Madison rents are being pushed up. They're just sort of like creeping up like that. So I feel like the reason why affordable housing is important to me is that there are things that we have to change at the state level. There are things that we have to change at the city level to make it more possible for us to advocate for our existing rights, right? But also that there are things that we can do right now. That you can get to know your neighbors, you can talk to your neighbors about rate increases, about repairs, and organize, right? That's it.
Thanks. I'm Heidi Wegleitner, and I'm a legal aid attorney, and I represent renters facing eviction and suing their landlords for landlord abuses and trying to access federal housing benefits. And I've been doing that for 20 years. And in 2012, I was elected to represent District 2 on the Dane County Board of Supervisors. I've worked a lot on housing justice issues during that time and expanding, well, really starting and growing Dane County's commitment to affordable housing and expanded renter protections. I was born in 1979 during the Carter administration, and my parents were able to live in Section 8 site-based, HUD subsidized housing. And a few years later, Reagan in office started slashing the HUD budget. And ever since then, we have had a real modern, homelessness crisis, because back then, in the 70s, there were not the sort of wait lists we see now, where they're not even open. You can't even apply for public housing. You can't even apply to get a Section 8 voucher. You have to wait every 3 years for a lottery to open up and just hope and pray that maybe your name will get picked, and then maybe you'll be eligible to get in because of all the barriers. So those are the sort of barriers like my clients face every day. And having that housing stability when I was little enabled my parents to finish college, to save, to be able to buy their own place where they have privacy, where they don't have a landlord breathing down their neck, where they don't, where they can raise a family and have some control over their lives. In this state of Wisconsin, over the last 15 years, we've seen renter protections gutted by Robin Voss and Scott Walker and a Republican-controlled legislature. And that's made things even worse. So yeah, we have a long way to go. I look forward to this conversation tonight, but and I'm happy to talk about some of the strategies we've used at the county level that work, but are just one little piece of meeting a vast need because of a national crisis.
Thank you, guys. Can we have a round of applause for the elders? I want to turn to the audience now. Does anybody have any questions or conversation starters? Yes, sir.
This is a question for all y'all. I'm coming from the military, so I have knowledge, or I lived in the barracks for many years, and that was, while not a good experience, it was housing. What are y'all's opinions on more of those group dormitory style accommodations, just as a way to bridge the gap between a large unhoused population and then having their own private apartment style tiny houses, whatever future path?
Sure, yeah. As a student, the dorms are, I think, people talk about college the best time of their lives, and I think part of that might be due to the time of your life, I'm sure. Also because you're in a place where, you naturally have a lot of people around you, it's very easy to interact with, and it's a very walkable environment. I think that, the university is really kind of exacerbating the crisis here in Madison by every year admitting more and more students, but not building more and more dorms to hold those students. I think that, some people, of course, wouldn't want to live in a dormitory, when they're in their 30s and all, but I think for those who might want to try it, you're trying to get back on your feet, you don't have a big support structure around you. It's a good way to be able to have housing and, meet people. And for students in particular, I think it's the state's obligation to, when they are bringing in more people here, to actually house people, not just push them off in the city of Madison and say, it's your problem now, not building more dorms.
So, having experienced temporary homelessness myself and having lived in my vehicle for about 3 months, I lived in a youth hostel just after that. For me, it was an upgrade from my car. But my larger take on this is that we shouldn't have to settle, right? The idea of kind of congregate housing in that way that is temporary is not as objectively is not as good for most people as kind of safe, supportive individual housing. And I think the data on how that impacts health and how it impacts people's ability to maintain a job and everything else, I think backs that up. It would be okay as a short-term stopgap measure if we're careful about it, but I don't think we should have to settle for that. I will say that we saw a Republican plan in both the Assembly and the Senate this year that we shamed them into not taking a vote on. And this is not that, but this is the worst possible congregate housing. What the Republicans were proposing initially in one bill, and then they split it up into two terrible bills. was making internment camps for folks who were unhoused. And I am not, this sounds like I'm exaggerating, making it up, I'm not. And in committee, I called it internment camps, and they would disagree with me. Making internment camps for folks who were unhoused, that the state would come in and seize the land from municipalities or counties that have higher than average unhoused populations. Force folks, if they're unhoused, to sleep within the confines of these internment camps, and then create a new felony for folks who were sleeping outside of the confines of these internment camps that would lock people up for the crime of existing in public. So I'm not saying that that's the way that it has to look. We could do relatively safe, supportive congregate housing, but when I hear that proposal, it goes to the worst case scenario, which is what the Republicans brought up this session, in which we shamed them into not taking a vote on it. And by we, I mean the community came out and said this is a terrible idea, terrible policy.
One thing I'm thinking about is the way that we've started framing the housing crisis in Madison is about like getting more beds versus getting more rooms. And I think that's not just how we think about like homelessness, but it's how we're thinking about like the student housing crisis as well. But like that, there's also some like gaps in that. Like if you're thinking about it only in terms of where you're, where you get to literally lay your head instead of like having a private space, like imagining a Madison where everyone in Madison has a private space. I know from my students that there are 4 people in an apartment now, 6 people in an apartment now, 2 people in the living room, or used to be the living room, So privacy, autonomy are things that we want to strive towards, So I also lived in a hostel when I was temporarily homeless, so I guess a lot of people have those sort of shared experiences. So it's not like, yes, that would help, but also, can we get more, or what does more look like?
And I think in thinking about the human right to housing too, like choice and liberty is a really important principle. So like we need to, I think about a variety of housing types and the spectrum that's needed on an emergency basis, on a temporary basis, on a long-term permanent basis. But people should have options. And I think we've lost a lot of single room occupancy housing, which I don't think is ideal or not necessarily what I would want. But it also was really one of the only affordable options for people, supporting themselves solely on a disability income, or somebody working a minimum wage job. And so like we have to also be real about what the conditions are right now, and all the people that need more options that don't have any legal options. Our unsheltered numbers are quite significant, and that doesn't mean we don't continue the vision for good quality housing that everybody wants and aspires to, whether that's that can look like a lot of different things, but we're not going to get there overnight. And I think there's a lot of folks that are more interested in shared housing options that can look a lot of different ways, and I think also there's ways to kind of balance privacy with community that can be really productive and create that, I think, within a social housing context too.
Okay, thank you for the question, and I really appreciate that you're a veteran. Thank you for your service. I just connected with a friend that I haven't spoken to since 2021 that joined the service because I joined the service as a socialist because like it's the only real way that you can have public health options and get an education and all of those things. So it's really sad that we have to make those choices sometimes, but also it's an amazing opportunity. I'm glad that we had it. I would ditto all the things about we can do better and what different types of housing are. And I think the last thing I want to add to this conversation is that when I hear or I think about like a dormitory style option, the first thing that came to my mind was when I worked at the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority, WEDA, and we were in DC lobbying all of our congressmen, and Glenn Grossman, yeah, his name is Grothman, but I call him Grossman. He missed the entire meeting. We met with his staff because, he was outside yapping. But, we come out of the meeting and then he comes waddling after us. And he's like, you're the housing people in Wisconsin, right? We're like, yeah. He's like, I hate you. And he's like, you all are putting people in these nice housing developments. And he was talking about how we did a tour with him in someone's home. I forget, he lives in like central Wisconsin, but it was like overlooking one of the lakes, and it was a decent housing opportunity. And he was like, these poor people, they shouldn't have that. Well, he didn't say poor people. He said, these people shouldn't have that. And we asked, okay, what do you think that they should have? And he's like, I think we should have the projects of Chicago. And that's like literally what they think. So when I hear the internment camp thing, the thing is that I think we need to change the perspective that we are not coming from a place of scarcity. Dane County spends more on homelessness than the state does for the entire state of Wisconsin. We have the opportunity to invest directly into our communities, and I think that looks like us building housing that isn't just like putting shit up so that people stay there. We know the public health consequences of putting people that are experiencing different crises related to being unhoused in the same space can actually hurt them. And I think putting people into mixed communities and having a plethora of resources that we should have is indeed possible. And that's why we need to be pushing for it way more than what the scarcity mindset would want us to push for.
Thank you for all your responses.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for all your responses. That kind of leads into the second question that I had. I'm going to expand off the second question. I think these got sent out to you guys, but my question was, what does decommodification look like in the short term versus the long term? But I want to kind of explain what I mean by that and expand on it, because I think it relates to what we're talking about here. Is like, how can we have not band-aid solutions that aren't going to be lasting in the long term, but how can we instead plant seeds so that in the short term we can make improvement, but that improvement expands and grows, and we can see the full decommodification someday in the future.
Well, I would say that we have to have, community public control of land, and we can do that right now with land banking. The city has a very small land banking program. The county does not yet, but it's something I would like to work on and initiate in the coming term. We have invested and partnered with the Madison Area Community Land Trust to keep land permanently affordable and expand home ownership opportunities for folks who have barriers because of income and other things. So I think that is a short-term thing, is actually, because right now all of our development, all of our housing, it's like driven by real estate developers, right? Investors, capitalists that only have a profit motive. And until we can actually protect land and be more proactive with what we want to develop equitably and have everyone be able to access it, we're gonna be in that commodification environment. So I think like that is a really important first step.
Yeah, that's great. I think that if the horizon is decommodification, you have to like understand, or like one of the first steps is getting people to question why we have rent in the first place, and why rent goes up every year in the first place. Like there's no reason for your landlord to increase your rent for $50 for no reason, like for no justification. And so developing a culture where we're starting to question that, I think is like one helpful first step. Another helpful first step is like doing research and paying attention to those trends in real time so that we have real data. Because they try to pull up the data of like, oh, our taxes are going up. And we should pull up our renter data, our tenant data of like, what can we afford? How much are our wages going up each year? And you know, is our rent increases matching inflation? The answer is no. The answer is always no. So paying attention to those sorts of things. And I think also like thinking about decommodification, one step in that is like making us more empowered, feeling more protected against repairs and these really, really fast eviction timelines. And I know a lot of that is stuff that we have to do at the state level or at the county level, but there are things that we can do at the city level to make it easier for people to report repairs, make it easier for repairs to be logged and flagged, you know, and make it easier, slow down the time that it takes for a landlord to get a person out of the building. Those things make it easier for people to organize and make it easier for us to get to the point where the housing doesn't have to have a cost, right? Like if we're asking for social housing, we're asking for people to not build housing with profit in mind. As in, we're building this housing and it's okay for you to lose money. And for us to get to that mindset of it's okay to lose money, you have to like feel protected.
You want us to go first?
I don't know where to start.
If you want to go, I have one last thing.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, if Ryan's nowhere to start, I'm not sure we all share either. But I think, I think one thing, if we're talking about changing the way we do housing, I forget if it's $5 million per year over the past 10 years or $10 million per year over the past, $10 million per year over the past 5 years. That's the amount of money we give in tips and tips, to get subsidized essentially development here in Madison. I think, we should take more of that money and put it towards land bank, put it towards building, some public housing here to begin with, to begin to, prepare to build public housing in the future and to set an example of what public housing can be like now. People would see, this isn't communist China's, prison block. And this is actually a good thing that is better than what I'm currently living in. And it's something I should strive for, pushing my politicians to support at every level.
Ditto everything. I think the short-term and long-term thing is stumping me a little bit. So I'm going to say the things that I think we should have. We should have social housing. We should have a public bank in order to help us build social housing. And we should have basic tenant protections and support more cooperative living situations. I think there's a few examples that come to mind when I think about this. One is throughout my previous districts in downtown Madison, there are a ton of co-ops that were developed in the 60s. Or not developed, but they were bought in the 60s, and cooperative living is a really good option for people. And one of the, I think, most recent examples of, if not cooperative, is co-housing situation is the Linden co-housing community down the street over here. It's like a bunch of people that got together and were like, hey, we want to have a decent space, but we don't need all of our homes, and they sold their homes and then built the Linden co-housing community, and it's really nice. And so thinking about ways that we can come together and be able to live as a community together, that also looks like us using our community land trust. Madison has a great community land trust, which allows us to buy land and then be able to sell the home value at a lower rate, because when you're buying a house, you're also buying land. And the last thing I will say, and to kind of what Bobby was getting at, is I have a deep and sincere frustration with genuinely like the way that we're approaching solving the housing crisis locally. There is a reason why the only type of development that we're seeing are these luxury, high-rise, out-of-state developers. It is in part because we spent the past 2 decades denying any new housing opportunity. And it's also because we're trying to overcompensate that by building enough beds and not like housing for actual people. And one example of that I see taking root is we sold the garage off of Lake Street by campus. And they're currently developing that into student housing development. And what they ended up doing is they set aside a certain number of units for affordable housing, which I think is a good start. But the overall like implication or impetus of that development was the idea from the city that we must recuperate all of the funds that we for us to redevelop another parking lot. And I think that's where decommodification can come in, like in the short run. There's a lot of city-owned property, there's a lot of state-owned property, Jeff 1 and Jeff 2, that we are going to be looking at turning into housing. The question to me is, do we want to turn it into luxury high-rise developments? Because it's very easy to sell them to an out-of-state developer for millions of dollars that we couldn't even think of the number of. Or we can actually use the land that we do have to build the type of housing that we want to see. And that's the best way we can do it right now. You got this, I believe in it.
So normally I would just, I'm a policy dork, so I would start talking right away about like 15 different bills that I have laid out here. But I want to step back and just talk about the state of the commodification of housing in Wisconsin right now, because it's really toxic. I think there's no better example of the deeply toxic nature of capitalism than housing in Wisconsin right now. When I first ran for assembly, the Dems did something, this is going way far afield, the Dems did something called speed dating for lobbyists, where all of the Dems would sit in a room, lobbyists would come around and pitch themselves to us. This wasn't what we call it, like they literally were calling it speed dating for lobbyists. And I felt dirty, I have not gone back to those in the past. And I spent a lot of my time fighting with the realtors, who are the most powerful lobby in the state, about why they wouldn't support the right to counsel, because it didn't make sense. I sat with them for an endorsement interview and fought with them again the whole time. And they sent me 2 $1,000 checks, which I took a picture of in the recycling bin, put up on social media, and said, this money doesn't belong in politics. I got a call within minutes from Democratic leadership saying, take that down. And me saying, hey, we haven't met yet, no. And the influence of the realtors in the Capitol is disgusting. I'm on the housing committee. When those folks walk into the room, people are just obsequious. They're holding out chairs for them. They're giving them whatever they want, both physically and in terms of legislation. One of the big victories that I thought I had in that committee was we had an okay piece of legislation that came through, and it would have provided $10 million for folks to renovate rental properties into condos. People could own their own units. It's a moderate upgrade. It's still a handout to developers, but it's maybe not as nefarious as some of the other ones. So I came up with an amendment that would have provided access to that same pool of money to co-ops. And I fought with the Republicans for an hour and a half, and I won. They voted for it, almost all of them. A couple of them were like, oh, like, Ryan's kind of out there, but this actually sounds like kind of a good idea. Let's try this. Let's try this thing that we haven't tried before. I put out a press release thanking my Republican colleagues for voting for this relatively lefty piece of legislation. And then we saw an email from Senator Noss. It was in all red capital letters, calling out his Republican colleagues,
Oh my gosh.
which he referred to as assembly comrades, and shaming them for having voted for communes because he doesn't understand the difference between cooperative housing or cooperative businesses, which he has in his own district, and communes. And every single Republican, including those on the committee, flipped and voted against that amendment when it was on the floor. There's that. There was the Coble decision, which basically was just a court saying if landlords do any of these 10 very obviously bad things, like kicking somebody out of their housing because they were a victim of a crime, then the tenant can sue them and get like double, triple damages. Just a totally normal thing. The realtors and the Republicans and the establishment Dems have spent so much time and money pushing back on this court decision and trying to put legislation in place that would erode one of the few things that's happened for Wisconsin tenants that's been positive over the last couple of decades, and it is sickening. So we have to look at cooperative housing, we have to look at social housing, and we have to not take the scraps that we are offering.
Great.
I don't know if that answered your question as well.
I didn't give a long-term answer, but I do think we need a state bill and, like U.S. and state constitutional right to housing that can be judicially enforced. I mean, I think that's really what we need. We should have had it back when the U.S. Housing Act was passed and the economic rights were being discussed. But I think that's like the long term. What we need are some actual meat on the bones constitutional rights that we can enforce to make sure everybody has a place to live and a kid's interest in not being made homeless is actually more important than a landlord's right to get their property back and make someone else.
Let's have another question from the audience.
This is actually not a question, but I just wanted to share some positive housing news that I heard recently. So the St. Paul City Council just extended the pre-eviction filing period to 60 days, at least temporarily, because obviously the Twin Cities in Minnesota have been dealing with the Operation Metro Surge, dealing with ICE, and the mayor of Minneapolis vetoed this same proposal in Minneapolis. But St. Paul had a unanimous vote to make it so that folks who are facing eviction, they have 60 days rather than, I don't know what we have. It's like 5 days in Wisconsin. It's ridiculous.
Good job. Well done. Oh, I must have it number one.
What's up?
I just want to say great job.
You can just dunk on the mayor.
Good.
Any other comments, questions right now in the back?
I just stay on.
Yeah.
This is actually Sam, I suppose. This is, I suppose, a policy question, not just for Representative Clancy, but I suppose for everyone else. This is just an example, an international example. So Singapore has a public housing system where it's a public option and it's also geared towards home ownership. So 80% of your resident population lives in public housing, and I think about 90% of them own their units. It's also tied to infrastructure development, public transport nodes, commercial centers, schools, hospitals, etc. I think the concept is called holistic development, something like that. I was just wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that specific policy, on that specific example, and whether or not we could apply that, perhaps not nationally, but in Wisconsin. I think St. Paul has around the same population as Wisconsin, roughly 6 million. Thank you.
Well, I'm not the policy person on the panel, but I'm going to answer first. I would say that the model legislation that we have in the United States, like, is called the Tenant Ownership to Purchase Act, Opportunity to Purchase Act, TOPA, T-O-P-A, which doesn't do exactly what you're describing, but it basically gives tenants the first opportunity to purchase a building with the understanding that gives the tenants a pathway towards ownership of the building. So building more programs like that, I think, is like one step towards like decommodification, or at least towards like public ownership, is like building in opportunities for tenants to buy back the building, or especially in situations right now, there's an uptick in landlord bankruptcy because short story is 2021, 2022, they bought a lot of housing, remember? They bought all of the housing, and now they're defaulting on all that housing that they bought. So when your landlord is defaulting, and there's a line on the building, etc., that should be an opportunity for tenants to stay in their house. That's one idea.
So I mean, yeah, what I know of the Singapore model makes sense, and I really like the model in Austria too. And what they have in common is that the housing is really good. It's really high quality. It's desirable. It is when you talk to folks, especially some folks here in Wisconsin and the United States, and you bring up the idea of publicly owned housing, they do think of the worst of what they've seen in movies about Chicago projects. And it does not need to look like that. In Austria, you have, you go to people who are not forced into public housing, but are looking at that as a really desirable way to live. It's full of amenities. It's a really good, genuinely social space. And I think we're going to need some examples of that on U.S. soil. And it's just getting that foot in the door so that we don't have unhinged senators talking about communes as a negative thing, and just fundamentally not understanding the things. But as I found out in committee, if you can sit down with people and you just talk it through with them, it does make sense to folks regardless of political persuasion as an option. I think, starting out with that as an option for folks is a foot in the door, and I think that's we're going to need those examples before we get more traction.
I'll take a crack at it. I think that like what you're talking about is the ideal. The ideal is that we would have public housing, that it would be connected to public transportation and public goods and public grocery stores and all of those things. I believe that the most achievable way we can think about that is thinking about how levels of government work together. And I say that like coming from someone that has worked in a city that is now working, or someone that has been a city alder, and then someone that's worked in the state assembly and other things. At a local level, we have seen, at least in Madison, the expansion of bus or rapid transit, which coincided with a transit-oriented development proposal, which then coincided with other proposals to like invest in certain communities. And we can quibble about like this and that, but I think from a municipal perspective, us being able to think about direct investment into our community along transit corridors, close to a public market that's about to open, etc. That's the goal. The only missing piece there is more public housing. And the hardship there is that we're entirely right now reliant upon the open market to decide where housing should be. We can't force people to develop, and we can't force them to develop the things that we want them to develop, or exactly the way we want them to, unless we own the land. And that's where the second level of like the state and federal government coming in, putting in money, the fact that for every dollar we send to the state, we only get 19 cents back in Madison. If we had more shared revenue, we would have more money to buy more land and to invest directly into our communities.
Yeah, I'm not gonna go to the policy. I think that I have nothing more to add to already said than that myself. But I think on these sort of, how do we win that? How do we fight for that as a system here in Wisconsin in a political sense? I think that, we look at systems like Social Security and Medicare. Why are they popular? Why are they so hard to cut? And the answer is because for the majority of people, they're systems that even if you're very comfortable, you still rely on, still interact with, still see in a positive way. If we can, there's a saying that in the 1930s, the FDR and New Democrats were like Santa. And like famous public operator said, like, we can't run on killing Santa. We have to like find another way to run this race so we don't look like we're the worst people in the world. We need to become Santa. We need to, show people, and it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of investment. But we need to show people, this is for youth, for all of us. The public housing is, something that is not to be scared of or not, dangerous and horrible for your city and horrible to live in. But it's a good, positive thing that can be beneficial to everyone in society. And until we get people to understand that fact, understand this can be a system that is beneficial for them and for everyone in their lives, even if they are themselves currently housed, currently living in a very comfortable place. Until we can get there, it's going to be very hard to win those large scale movements.
I think it's important to flag that cooperative housing already exists as a model here in Madison, and that also community land trust exists as a model that you can use even if you don't personally have, that's why CLTs exist. CLTs exist for people who can't necessarily afford to purchase their land outright. And there are municipalities in the US that have organized tenants within CLTs. So there's CLTs for residential lots, there are CLTs for commercial lots that have residential buildings on top of it, residential apartments on top of it. So no one actually has to buy the land, but they're getting the benefit from the fact that that land is community owned, community protected.
Question, can you define community land trust, just if anyone doesn't know what that is, or can someone define that?
Well, it's like when the land trust, which is usually like a nonprofit organization, here we have a Madison area community land trust, they own the land underneath, and then the homeowner that participates in their program owns the building on top, and then the amount of equity that the homeowner has is sort of limited based on how that, so the land underneath they keep permanently affordable, and it's more affordable for that person to purchase that home, get a loan on the building on top, because it doesn't cost as much money, and then they keep it permanently affordable, and then when they sell it, they're not getting as much of a profit, but they're getting some, and they're the owner.
It's basically to protect it protects the land from speculative value. So you control how much the land is able to appreciate over time, how much you're able to charge over time. You control that, which stops it from being this thing that now a state developer purchases, and then suddenly it's worth $2 million, and now we're only selling it to people who are building roller coasters, etc.
I was just gonna say that with public housing, like we have not had new public housing in this country for decades. So like when we're talking about privatization and commodification of housing, like that's been occurring within our federal housing programs for a really long time. For sure, you know, 70s, 80s, and today, like all of the capital improvements you see in the CDA Triangle, out by CDA Truax, like that's all, they're bringing in private equity. They're changing how those public housing projects are governed, and their ownership structure to privatize them. I mean, they're still controlled by the public housing agency, but it is changing the rules. And in some cases, reducing renter protections there because of the privatization of what has been for a long time public housing, which yes, has its reputation as maybe in some places not being kept up. That's because we stopped funding it, stopped investing in the maintenance of it. So we can do that. We can do that at the state level. We could do it at the federal level again and build high quality housing, but the government has to take a much more prominent role like it does in Singapore, right? Like it does in Austria. That's not what we have right now. We haven't had it in 60 years, a long time.
Yeah, so I was at a neighborhood association meeting a couple months ago. The issue on the table was there was an existing housing complex that developers wanted to knock down, displace all the residents that were living there, build a new complex up, charge 3 times the rent, and no one could afford to live there anymore who is living there currently. And so we've talked a lot about like building new housing. My question is, how do we protect the old housing? How do we keep people, housed in the apartments that they're living in now?
Which neighborhood?
It was Marquette.
Where? What development?
I do not remember off the top of my head.
Do you know where it was?
No, I would need to think about that.
Okay.
So the state gives out so many dollars in grants to developers and all that, and it's not like that the money isn't available for things like that. You could make grants available for actual affordable housing, not the sort of affordable housing that means you make a huge high-end development and you have a certain number of units set aside for a certain number of years, then it becomes market rate again. You could target dollars to provide money to renovate those units specifically under the median percentage of median income or anything else. We're just not getting creative with the many, many, many dollars that are out there that are just handed over to for-profit developers right now.
Rent control. That's like the answer. The reason why, and I think in Madison, like I was saying, we spent decades denying any new housing to the extent that like now we have not enough housing for the people that live here, but not enough housing for the people that are going to live here. And Madison will grow by tens of thousands of people in the next decade. So when we talk about building this kind of block housing in deep neighborhoods on the east side, on the north side, and the outskirts of Madison, I mean, the reason why that is happening is because we didn't build enough, and then our solution right now is just build wherever we can. And at a local level, we have no mechanism to challenge the amounts of rent that they are charging, because at the state level, we have prohibited rent control and inclusionary zoning. So, Ryan, are you gonna do something about that? We have a lot of bills to do something about that. But that's the sample answer for that specific thing. And then I think it comes down to what our city zoning is. I know that we are working to increase height limits in certain areas and to like make different area plans.
I think what should be thought about or included in those area plans is like, where are the housing that we want to keep, what needs to be redeveloped, and like kind of what kind of redevelopment we want. When I was a student Alder, I fought fucking hard to protect different certain houses around the campus area because they're building these large luxury high-rise developments. Then I learned, I went into those houses and they were, just a bunch of slumlords. And the thing is that for the people that want to protect the older housing stock that we have, is that a lot of houses weren't built to last forever, and they are falling apart. And that's where having a thought process about like, and also the mechanisms to protect the affordability of those houses are important. But I don't really think that the answer is building like big block developments like we see downtown out here in the outskirts of Madison. I think that we should be focusing on building more homeownership and different types of housing communities that actually focus on like family-oriented development in these areas. So it's multifaceted.
I mean, that just made me think about like somebody early at the very beginning of our conversation mentioned walkable neighborhoods. Long-term goal should be about like making sure that the amenities around the city are like easily accessible regardless of where you're living, right? Because like we are getting more development in the more rural parts of Madison. And there are spaces where if you're trying to take the bus to a grocery store, it's gonna be about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours, etc. So that cuts into your commute to work and all this sort of stuff. So thinking about what kinds of public amenities, not just public housing, but what kinds of public amenities are available to people and what kind of quality of life is available to people, I think is another part of the equation.
Yeah, and I think we can support, home ownership and, rental rehab loans, no interest loans for these owners, and restrict the deeds to require them to be affordable and to have lower rents. For the first time in 2025, I sponsored a budget amendment to create a funding stream, $8 million for non-Section 42 WIDA financed affordable housing projects, smaller projects. So we're talking, 4, 8-unit co-ops, preservation projects. It could be acquisition and rehab, but part of that funding is long-term affordability requirements and renter protections and lower barriers to accessing those housing units. So, I think there are tools we have right now that we can use at the county level, at the local level, and with state money, we could really expand how we protect more naturally occurring affordable housing. It doesn't have to mean let your property go to shit. It can mean, we'll help you, put in more energy efficient windows and doors, right? But and if you're gonna be renting that out, you gotta keep those rents controlled and affordable for folks. So I think there are things we can do better to be more mindful of the different types of housing that folks are looking for, and different ways to find affordability. And those are smaller projects, and partnering with co-ops and things like that. It's not, going into the giant, big time, profit driven developer community. Yeah.
The term naturally occurring affordable housing definitely triggered something in me. It's just something we heard so many times at council. I would say the one thing is that my issue with the term is that people tend to assume that if the house was built before 1970 that it's affordable, and that isn't always the case, especially when we have a lot of developers or landowners that own large quantities of housing that was built before the 70s. But I will say that there's housing out in the communities that I'm talking to right now on the north side and the east side that bought their home in like the 50s for like $20,000, and now they're like 80 years old and really want to downsize but can't because because if they sell their home, what else are they going to buy for that's cheaper or that's better, where they're going to turn a profit? And to that extent, I think that this is where we need to start thinking again about housing for actual people and not just beds. Think about what it means if we invest directly into senior housing or senior living communities. And if we took that and like identified those people and like said, hey, would you like to rent out your place for like a lower amount of rent? And maybe they'd be more interested in that than someone that is a large luxury high-rise developer. So.
Thank you guys. Turn again to the audience, see if anybody has anything right now.
Thank you all for getting up here and talking. We had a lot of really interesting conversations. A number of questions. I think, maybe I'll split a couple. But the first one would be, what is actually affordable housing? At a local level versus at a national level. When we talk about AMI, like 80% AMI, that's not really affordable, right? 60% maybe a little there. But so I guess I would help me just understand this better. But something I struggle with is thinking about, I think generational wealth, the fastest way to get there, the fastest way to grow, is through home ownership. It's through your example of like houses in this neighborhood, they were $20,000 in the 70s, and now they're $300,000, $400,000. How, you buy a house in this neighborhood, it goes up $30,000, $40,000 a year. If you can afford to buy in, you can't make better money from the stock market. So the home ownership is if you can't get into home ownership, it's much harder to grow and that's to grow into retirement without having a really good job. So that being said, talking about putting land trusts and I know people who live there and yes, it was the only way they could afford that house 20 years ago, but when they look at their friends who now have also bought a house 20 years ago that could have had a little better job, now they can't afford to sell. They can't afford to move on. They can't downsize because it is locked in. So it's an amazing program to get people into it, but you're not growing that generational wealth the same way as this big house. So that being aside, I think because I work with the new land trusts on projects, I think it's a great program. But as we think about so I guess my real question is what is, I guess, everyone's opinion on the best way to solve affordable housing? I don't necessarily think it's in doing land trusts as much as I like working with them and the work they do. In terms of making a bigger impact, I think you kind of like you were saying, it's getting into the heart of the community. It's getting to being able to access a neighborhood or walk on it. That gets more into it when I think about home ownership and smaller scale development. But it doesn't solve affordable housing, right? But we don't want to create green in Madison. We don't want massive sky, and issues with when you develop a building so large that it takes the human, connection out of it, and then you start to develop other issues with that in terms of projects. So what is that medium ground where it's like I don't think it's necessarily small scale development, or even 4 unit, 8 units. Versus I don't necessarily think it's a 50-story skyscraper. So is there a sweet spot in your guys' world of thinking about affordable housing, where what is that sweet size of like, you know, I think of it as a square foot, you know, square foot versus envelope ratio. Like, you know, you can get a lot more efficiency out of a building that can house a lot of people. Thinking about community and amendments in that can create a community so it doesn't feel like it's isolating people. So that long-winded way of saying is like, what truly is affordable housing, and what in your guys' world is the best way to get there, or most efficient way to get there that is finding that balance.
Okay, so Juliana, raise your hand.
Yeah, I'm so fucking ready for this. Okay, I'm gonna start from the back end of your question and work forward. We need to lower fucking property taxes. I don't think that we can solve our housing crisis without solving our public school financing crisis. Property taxes in our city has nearly doubled in the past 5 years. So has our rents. And that is a direct result of Republicans underfunding public education so that we have to go to endless fucking referendums in order to fund our schools because we are decent human beings. And with that, how's the home ownership, like you said, should be a wealth building opportunity, but that wealth building opportunity is being taken from us every time our rents jump up 5%, 10%, 20% every year. So we have less money in our pockets to save and build that wealth. So that's number one for wealth building. Number two, I believe that affordable housing is the amount that you pay that is affordable to you. I would actually argue 80% AMI is affordable if you are someone that falls into that area. And for those that don't know, AMI means average median income. In Dane County, our average median income is around $90,000. 80% of that is somewhere around, I want to say like $78,000. Could be wrong. Then you're looking at like 40 to 60% is like $40,000 to $60,000, give or take. My numbers could be a little off here. The issue that we're seeing in Dane County, or at least Madison specifically, that I find very fascinating, is that we are very good at building affordable housing to those that fall within that 50% to 80% AMI range. We are very good at building low-income housing tax credit properties, similar to the Oscar in the Oscar Meyer neighborhood, or the Valor on East Washington, or Union Corners, that are for people that are like workforce housing. And that's like actually a bipartisan supported bill by Republicans and Democrats, because to establishment Dems and Republicans, workforce housing, or people that are working, are a lot easier to house than people that they perceive as poor and lazy and not working. But we know people making like less than $50,000 a year are working. And that's where I think us making those direct investments to the people that need housing that is affordable to them is important. People that are above 80% AMI, or people making more than like $80,000, there's not enough homes for them to buy that is affordable to them. People making less than $50,000 a year, there's not enough homes for them to buy. I'm assuming that people like under 30,000 want to like rent, but there's not enough homes for them. Pardon me for that assumption in my brain. But I think that's where, when we talk about building public housing and different housing options, we have to factor those in different income levels into that equation.
I want to build off of what Juliana mentioned, which was the idea of, the underfunding of public schools contributing to higher property tax and higher costs for homes in Madison. It's also true with the university education. We've seen in the past couple decades, state funding used to be about 40% of the funding for universities in Madison. Now it's about, I believe, 10%, and federal funding and tuition have taken a lot of handle of that. You know, what that means is that, you know, with tuition, we're having a lot more students come here who can pay higher tuition, who can pay more money. You know, to give an anecdotal example of this, if you go through the, you know, Instagram pages of all the new Wisconsin people, you know, at least the year I did, you know, a lot of people from Marin County in California, a lot of people from New York and Connecticut, and to use actual data, my dad, who works in Milwaukee, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, was his face was priceless. Like, it was just absolutely gobsmacked when he saw that the year I got into Wisconsin was the first year in the history of the university that it had less than half the students came from the state of Wisconsin. You know, we're getting more out-of-state students can pay higher and higher rent. You know, this is why. I mean, I live in where it's affordable for a student these days, which is about $800 a month apartment that I share with someone. It was meant to be a 1-bedroom, 1 studio, but we made it 2-bedroom because that's how it is here. But you know, the Grand Central XL1, which are also in the university area, which are much larger apartments. I think they're about $1,300 a month nowadays. You know, all the new big ones are about $1,300 a month around. Yeah.
16,
No.
16.
16, really? Wow.
Well, more. Average rent in Madison is 1,400.
Fair. I mean, but
No,
it's
it's not.
at least for the students, you know.
Yeah,
At least my opinion. That's a high rent. I would not. That's why I would not go to, you know. I have friends who live 15 minutes south of campus because they were able to, you know, 4 of them in one place together were able to get $400 a month. That's good to get around. So I think that, you know, yeah, like these state decisions around funding education drive, whether it comes to property taxes, whether it comes to who's coming to this university and coming to the city, you know, drive the housing market as well. Yeah, keep that in mind.
So I think it's probably not right to look at housing affordability as having like one solution. For me, it looks like yes and, right? We should have social housing, we should have cooperative housing, we should have rent control, we should lower property taxes and have the rich pay for education instead. It's a great bill, by the way. It should look like, you know, maybe just eating 1 or 2 of the worst landlords as an example, or failing that, you know, passing a tenant protection package that makes it much more difficult to be a terrible landlord in Wisconsin. And the impact of that is real. So when I passed right to council in Milwaukee in 2011, they did a study about a year later, and they looked at the top, I think, 30 housing markets across the US. And every single one of them, except for 2, experienced a higher proportion of corporate-owned housing over the year that they looked at it. The only 2 markets that went the other way, where you had more actual people owning their homes than corporations in that year, were out in Washington and Milwaukee, where we both passed the right to counsel. Because corporate landlords looked at that and said, this is not a market that I want to expand in. And you can do that down the line. You can make it tough to be a terrible landlord, and we can, just as a result of making it less of a fertile place to be bad. The policies themselves will help, and it will discourage the worst landlords from spreading as they have been.
I think I would define affordable housing as your housing, your utility, and your transportation costs altogether not exceeding 30% of your monthly income. And that is how, that's not quite how it is defined for purpose of public housing in the Section 8 programs, because transportation is not taken into account, and I think it should be. But that's what it means to be affordable, is that you should pay based on your ability to pay. You shouldn't become homeless because you get sick, or you lose your job, or you know, or you are on a limited income because you're on disability, or you're still waiting to get disability. So I think what the model that's largely the largest model, the most predominant model, has been referred to many times already, the sort of Section 42 low-income housing tax credit program. And that's not affordable for a lot of working class folks, right? And it's definitely not affordable for people who are on SSI or W-2 or, working minimum wage jobs. They're gonna be at half. They're gonna be at 15% of the area median income. When there's not that level in any of these tax credit projects, right? They're at, the lowest are 30% area median income. And so they're at half of that. That means like they're still paying way beyond, even if they're in a 30% unit. That said, we don't have any nonprofit developers that have capacity to develop more housing right now in Dane County. Really, all of them they'll partner with a larger developer on a tax credit project. We don't have any public housing agencies that are like, yeah, we'll develop more housing right now. Like, that is a really big problem. So we are creating a lot of units, and we're getting a lot of bang for our buck by providing gap financing for those low-income housing tax credit projects in Dane County. And since 2015 through 2025, we have invested $75 million and created, thousands of units. And, each year we're trying to get more for those dollars, okay? So now 20% of those units in every project have to be at the 30% level. 20% have to be specifically set aside for people who are experiencing homelessness. They have to commit to a whole range of tenant protections by getting this county funding. They have to fund support on-site supportive services. They have to meet certain sustainability standards. So through our funding contracts, it's really one of our major tool at the county level to get something from these developers that want to make money doing this housing. So it's been pretty successful. We've gotten a lot for what we're putting in, but it's far from perfect. And it's not, we're not creating as much as we need for the people who need it most. And that's why we really need more, a much larger public role for housing creation.
We're getting a little bit low on time here, but before we wrap up, I want time for one or two more questions. I wanted to ask, how do you guys feel about how things like gentrification and exclusionary zoning should be tackled? Because that, like Ryan said, there's the housing issue. There's a million things we need to do to fix it, and a big problem is zoning laws that are awful and kind of also tie into very aggressive gentrification kind of practices that happen in cities.
Let's take that first.
We're all fine with gentrification.
Okay, yeah, gentrification is amazing. Redlining, oh my god. I wish I had thought of her. But no, I really think, so they did this out in a municipality out of state, I'm forgetting where, but instead of redlining, they called them green zones. So the areas that have been previously redlined were then actually created like a green zone for the zoning practices so that we put more investment in that area. I think I'm spitballing here, but I think there also needs to be a bit of a mental shift in general. Right now, we are directing all of our municipal resources downtown Madison, and the places that were redlined in Madison were not downtown Madison and not University Heights. They were Kennedy Heights up here on the north side. They were the areas of on the south side in the Greenbush neighborhood that was quite literally bulldozed over. And I know it's not as flashy, but when we think about just putting little things here and there, when we think about just like cleaning up the fucking dog park so dogs aren't dying in Warner Dog Park. Yeah, I know, Winnie and I don't go there anymore. no offense to Warner, hopefully they get their shit together, but those are the things that like can really make a difference in people's lives. And I had to think a little bit more about gentrification, but again, spitballing here, I think it goes back to what we've been saying about like large luxury out-of-state developers, and what it means to actually invest in the Madison community. And Heidi actually just had an amazing point about the gap in local nonprofit or public housing development.
I'm not going to pretend that I am the all-knowing one who has the one solution to gentrification, including our zoning. You know, I think that it's an unfortunate fact that I love Madison. Madison's a great city. I think I've loved being here extremely. But the city is built on a history of redlining and a history of bold agreement. It's built. I mean, if you want to go back very far, when the first Groners came to Green Lake, Wisconsin, they found plentiful land being sold by the U.S. federal government because about 15 or 20 years earlier, the land around Dane, what was called by the Mahojang people, was forcibly ceded to the United States federal government, and they were all forced to West Mississippi, which they repeatedly attempted to return from and repeatedly forced back across. Unfortunately, a lot of the best places I've ever been have been places that are built this entire country on, first exploitation of the native people here, and then the genocide of native people here, and then exploitation of black and brown communities here, and then there again, literal demolition. I had a class where we registered an extra the medical and psychological effects. People who were living there experienced heart attacks, experienced a much higher rate of cardiac events due to the stress of having to fight the city like day and night just to be able to live here. So and I think that we do have to, in sort of a way of reparation, to trying to reinvest in these communities we have been for decades and centuries of cases been attempting to destroy. Investing outside of downtown, investing outside of the place where perhaps most financial. Going back to decommodifying housing, not thinking about it as, where's the most financially efficient way to invest, but hey, where's the best place to invest? How can we right our wrongs in history? How can we invest in a way that's maybe not financially efficient, but is the way that society should think about housing, which is addressing the wrongs and trying to build a better future.
So why do we have fucking Jamba Juice on State Street? I'm so sorry about that. I think stopping gentrification looks like not having that and investing in more local businesses.
Yeah, I think that, so I'm originally from Oakland, California. I moved here from Brooklyn, and I think that while I was in Brooklyn, that's where I kind of came to terms with my identity as a black gentrifier. So Madison, the way that people talk about Madison, we're not gonna fight gentrification. We're not going to stop gentrification. Gentrification is here. Madison is one of the fastest gentrifying cities that I have personally witnessed in my life. And I moved here from Brooklyn, So what does it mean to be a responsible gentrifier? I think is what the conversation looks like in New York. And one of the ways that you, as a gentrifier, I'm not talking, I don't know who's from here and who's not, but do you know your neighbors? Do you know your neighbors' names? Do you have their phone numbers? That's a good first place to start, is getting to know your neighborhood and becoming a citizen of your neighborhood. As the people who are really into our neighborhood, our neighborhood centers, for example, are really plugged in, are really in the know every little group and what everybody's doing, what everybody's talking about. You can be plugged in. So that's the first step about how to respond to gentrification, if not just stop it, is building out the social fabric of your neighborhood and participating in the existing social fabric of your neighborhood. The other thing is I know that we have a high turnover in Madison, especially from renters, and a lot of that is out of renters' control. But if I could have a magic wand, that would be one thing I'd fix, is when tenants stay in the same place for longer than 2 years, 3 years, they feel more at home there. They they feel more a part of the neighborhood. So even lifelong Madisonians move around, you know, and lifelong Madisonians who are renters will not stay in the same neighborhood, you know. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I love that answer, and I think obviously, like, we can get some changes in the state legislature, like we can hopefully pass some of these bills that Ryan has been vociferously writing. Like, there's so many bad things that, like, bad bills and laws that we need to roll back, but then there's also like new things, like requiring just cause for eviction, right? Like, to really expand security of tenure, increasing those notice periods to 30 days, to 60 days, right? To give people more stability. And I think those opportunities for more resident-controlled housing models, right? Making it hostile to those out-of-state absentee landlords, like by making sure renters have access to lawyers to fight back, to support their efforts to acquire, you know, ownership and exercise options that they might want to pursue. So I think it's all of those things, and that's really important. I also think, like, some of our affordable housing strategies and in creating multifamily housing, you know, has really driven up rents. Like, there's no doubt about it, and Revel Sim's research at UW, like, documents this. Like, we're trying to do something with upzoning and creating more housing with the idea it's increasing supply is gonna bring down rents, but it's not actually happening right now, and it's actually really destabilizing to some of these areas. That doesn't mean we're gonna stop, like, creating housing or developing, but I think we really need to understand the consequences of it and mitigate those really negative impacts.
Thank you, guys. We're gonna have to wrap up now. Elliot's gonna have some announcements here in just a moment. Firstly, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. And thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for being here and giving such amazing insight. And also, thank you to the volunteers who helped put this together. I want to give a shout out to Dylan, whose arms are probably going numb there recording this whole thing. But thank you to all of our volunteers for helping put this together.
Can I say thank you real quick?
Yes, absolutely.
I just want to thank my fellow panelists and the folks that set this up, but also all of you. It's so frustrating being in spaces where our thoughts and our ideas about housing are constrained. It feels so good to be in this space where, I mean, both my fellow panelists and the questions are so much bigger than what we're talking about in the places where we have power. So just thank you for that.
Yes. Woo woo.
Thank you. Now I'll turn it to Alder first.